In this video, we are going to examine the evidence for the Old Testament documents and what history has to say. It really comes down to the quality of the manuscripts. For classical giants like Plato, Homer, and Tacitus, we consider their work historically reliable because of a field called textual criticism. It's how we check that the words we're reading today are what the authors actually wrote. So, what happens when we turn that same historical magnifying glass on the Bible? Some argue that because the biblical manuscripts were copied repeatedly over centuries, errors and alterations may have accumulated, potentially affecting the original wording. Scribes were human, right? Mistakes happen. And with high-stakes religious texts, people's motives can get complicated. So, did the text drift? Is what we have today just a distorted echo? In this video, we're putting the biblical manuscripts under the microscope of textual criticism to see if they hold up as reliable historical documents. We're going to set aside faith and miracles for a moment and focus purely on the physical evidence. We'll look at ancient scrolls and fragments, compare them to each other, and measure them by the same standards we use for every other ancient document. The results might just surprise you. The worry is that for centuries, the Old Testament manuscripts were passed down, scribe after scribe, copying by hand. You can just imagine a little error here, a dropped line there. Wouldn't all those tiny mistakes pile up over 1,000 years and totally distort the original? It's not a crazy thought. If the biblical texts were copied carelessly without anyone checking the work, we'd expect to see exactly that kind of decay. We'd expect a version of Isaiah from Egypt to be totally unrecognizable from one found in Palestine. Key events, names, and teachings would contradict each other, leaving us with uncertainty about the original words. And let's be honest, these texts are the foundation of major world religions. The motive to intentionally change something, maybe to prop up your own theology or tear down someone else's, seems pretty high. It's a real concern that a scribe might have tweaked the text to fit their own beliefs. So the problem is twofold: the high chance of accidental errors creeping in over time, and the potential for deliberate changes. If that model is true, we should have almost zero confidence that the Old Testament we read today is anything like what was originally written. That's the challenge. And to answer it, we have to go to the evidence. We need to look at the manuscripts themselves. For centuries, this whole question of textual change was tough to answer for the Old Testament. Our oldest complete copies of the Hebrew Bible were medieval manuscripts, like the Leningrad Codex from around 1008 AD. That's a gap of more than 1,400 years from when the last books were written. It's a huge amount of time, leaving plenty of room for doubt. For a long time, all scholars could do was compare these medieval texts to ancient translations like the Greek Septuagint. They just didn't have any truly ancient Hebrew manuscripts to check them against. Then, in 1947, everything changed. A Bedouin shepherd, looking for a lost goat near the Dead Sea, threw a rock into a cave and heard pottery shatter. What he found inside would become the single greatest manuscript discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Over the next decade, archaeologists pulled a treasure trove of over 900 manuscripts out of 11 caves near Qumran. These scrolls, dated from around 250 BC to 68 AD, were like a time capsule of Jewish life and literature from around the time of Jesus. And most importantly, they included over 200 manuscripts of the Old Testament, texts that were an incredible 1,000 to 1,200 years older than any Hebrew copy known before. Suddenly, scholars had a time machine. They could take a manuscript from, say, 100 BC, put it right next to a manuscript from 900 AD, and see exactly what had changed over 1,000 years. The authenticity and accuracy of our previous manuscripts was finally being put to the ultimate test. The most famous example is the Great Isaiah Scroll, a 24-foot-long, complete manuscript of the book of Isaiah, dated to about 125 BC. When scholars painstakingly compared this ancient scroll to the version of Isaiah in the medieval Masoretic Text from over 1,000 years later, the results were stunning. The texts were virtually identical. Over a millennium of copying, the book of Isaiah had been preserved with breathtaking accuracy. To give you an idea, in chapter 53, the differences were astonishingly minor. A famous example often cited notes that Out of 166 words, the variations came down to just a handful of letters. Most of these were simple spelling differences, like writing honor versus honor, no change in meaning at all. A few others were tiny stylistic changes, like adding a conjunction and. Only one significant variant was a three-letter word for light, which actually clarifies the verse and is backed up by other ancient translations like the Septuagint. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved with hard physical evidence that any doubts about the accuracy of existing manuscript copies was dead wrong. The Old Testament hadn't been hopelessly corrupted. It had been preserved with a degree of accuracy that was almost unbelievable. This discovery confirmed that the Jewish scribes who copied these texts were performing a sacred and meticulous duty of preservation. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a massive piece of the puzzle, but they don't stand alone. The reliability of the Old Testament text is confirmed by what scholars call a convergence of evidence. Think of it like a court case with 4 independent witnesses. They were in different places, speaking different languages at different times, but they all tell the same basic story. Our first witness is the one we've been talking about, the Masoretic Text. This is the traditional Hebrew Bible, painstakingly standardized by Jewish scholars called Masoretes, between 500 and 900 AD. They developed an incredibly rigorous system, counting every letter, word, and paragraph. They knew the middle letter of the Torah and the middle word of the entire Hebrew Bible. They treated the text not just as a document, but as the very word of God. The Leningrad Codex from around 1008 AD is our oldest complete copy of this tradition. Our second witness is the Dead Sea Scrolls. As we just saw, these texts from Qumran, dating as far back as 250 BC, are our ancient checkpoint. They come from a separate Jewish community, working 1,000 years before the Masoretes, and their text is over 95% identical to the Masoretic text, with most differences being minor spelling variants. This shows an incredible continuity. Our third witness takes us to Egypt, the Septuagint. This is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, made by Jewish scholars in Alexandria. The translation process began in the 3rd century BC. This was for the huge population of Greek-speaking Jews. The Septuagint is crucial because it's a completely independent translation from a different region, and it's even older than most of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It gives us a snapshot of the Hebrew text from that era, and when we compare it to the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls, we once again find substantial agreement. Now, the Septuagint does have some fascinating differences. It includes books like Tobit and Maccabees, known as the Apocrypha, which aren't in the final Hebrew Bible. And some books like Jeremiah are shorter. But far from undermining reliability, this actually strengthens the case. It shows that even with some known variations in the pre-Christian era, the core text shared between these traditions is overwhelmingly consistent. Our fourth and final independent witness is the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is the version of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, preserved by the Samaritan community, who split from mainstream Judaism centuries before Christ. This text is another isolated stream of transmission. While there are about 6,000 differences from the Masoretic text, most are minor spelling and grammar changes. About 1,900 of these variants actually align with the Septuagint, but the overall story, laws, and history remain the same, proving the text of the Torah has been stable even across deeply divided communities. So, what we have isn't a flimsy chain of transmission. We have 4 separate independent lines of evidence from the Masoretic text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, all converging on the same essential text. This gives historians immense confidence that the text we have today is a faithful representation of the original. So far, we've just looked at the Bible on its own. But to really grasp how incredible its preservation is, we need some context. We need to run it through the bibliographical test. This is a standard historical method for judging any ancient document. It asks 3 simple questions. How many manuscripts do we have? What's the time gap between the original and our oldest copy? And how consistent are those copies? Let's apply this to some of the most famous and trusted works of ancient history. Take Plato. We have only about 7 to 9 good manuscripts of his works. The time gap between when he wrote it and our earliest complete copy is a staggering 1,200 years. Yet no classical scholar seriously doubts that we have the words of Plato. Or how about Caesar's Gallic Wars? It survives in only about 10 good manuscripts, with the oldest one dating to 900 years after Caesar lived. The famous Roman historian Tacitus, his annals rely on just 2 primary manuscripts from around 800 years after his time. For Thucydides' history, it's 8 manuscripts and a 1300-year time gap. The undisputed champion of ancient secular literature is Homer's Iliad. It boasts at least 1,900 surviving manuscript copies, and scholars universally accept its text as reliably preserved. Now let's run the Old Testament through that same test. How many manuscripts? Not dozens or hundreds. We have tens of thousands of Hebrew manuscripts and fragments, including some 10,000 from the Cairo Genisa storeroom alone. What about the time gap? Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was around 1,400 years, similar to other ancient texts. But with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that gap shrank dramatically. We now have copies of biblical books from within 200-300 years of their composition, a time gap that's almost unheard of for ancient literature. And how about accuracy? As we've seen, comparing texts 1,000 years apart reveals a word-for-word identity of over 95%. Homer's Iliad, the best-preserved secular text, is estimated to be about 95% pure. The Old Testament manuscripts meet and even exceed that standard. When you lay the evidence side by side, the conclusion is unavoidable. If we trust the works of Plato, Caesar, and Thucydides as historically reliable, then by that same standard, and honestly by a much higher one, we have to accept the Old Testament as a remarkably well-preserved document. To dismiss the Old Testament's textual reliability would require a level of skepticism that, if applied consistently, would force us to toss out almost everything we know about the ancient world. If you're finding this deep dive into historical evidence compelling, and you want to separate more historical fact from popular fiction, then consider subscribing to this channel. We regularly tackle these kinds of questions. Click that subscribe button and hit the bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Okay, but what about all the so-called errors? Skeptics love to point out that scholars have found hundreds of thousands of variants or differences among biblical manuscripts. That number sounds huge and scary, suggesting a text that's hopelessly confused. But this objection completely misunderstands what a textual variant is. First off, having a lot of variants isn't a weakness. It's a direct result of having a ton of manuscripts. If you only have 2 copies of a book, you can't have many differences. If you have thousands upon thousands, you're naturally going to have more. The massive number of biblical manuscripts is what creates this large number, and it's actually a strength. It gives scholars way more data to work with to zero in on the original text. So, what are these so-called errors? The vast majority, well over 99%, are completely trivial. Most are just spelling differences. Like an American writing color and a Brit writing color, Hebrew scribes had minor spelling conventions that changed over time. These account for a huge number of variants but have zero effect on the meaning. Other variants include changes in word order, which often don't matter in languages like Hebrew and Greek, or forgetting to add the. For example, the prophet versus prophet. Again, no change in meaning. And then you have simple slips of the pen, where a tired scribe might skip a word or write one twice. These are usually obvious and easy to fix by comparing manuscripts. When you filter out all that noise, the number of variants that are both meaningful, they could change the sense of the passage, and viable, they could plausibly be original, is incredibly small. Textual critics estimate that our certainty about the Old Testament text is around 99.5%. And critically, not a single one of these questionable passages affects any core doctrine or teaching. So when you hear about hundreds of thousands of errors, remember, that number is mostly noise. It's a testament to the wealth of evidence we have, not a sign that the text is corrupt. So let's go back to our original question. How accurate are the biblical manuscripts? We started with the popular idea that the scribes who copied the manuscripts could have introduced errors. But when we actually look at the evidence, a completely different picture emerges. We saw how the incredible discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls acted as a time machine, proving the Old Testament text stayed remarkably stable for over 1,000 years. we saw how 4 independent witnesses, the Masoretic Text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Greek Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, all point to the same consistent text, despite being separated by centuries, continents, languages, and communities. We saw that when measured against the same bibliographical test used for all other ancient literature, the Old Testament's manuscript evidence is in a league of its own. And we saw that the claims of countless errors are misleading, with the vast majority being trivial and having no impact on the text's meaning. Based purely on the principles of historical and textual criticism, the conclusion is clear. The Old Testament we read today is an exceptionally well-preserved and reliable historical document. The Jewish scribes who copied these texts did so with a reverence and a meticulousness that is virtually unmatched in the ancient world. When you open an Old Testament, you can be confident that you are reading a faithful transmission of words written down thousands of years ago. By the standards of history, the biblical manuscripts don't just pass the test, they set the standard. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.